2021 was the best year for Indian startups. There was a record amount of VC funding that was coming in, the second fastest growing ecosystem. So I think lots is happening.
Jivraj Singh Sachar is the host of the Indian Silicon Valley podcast, which is India's number one startup podcast. He began this journey to explore and learn about the Indian startup ecosystem, creating a platform for those curious about it.
That is very, very interesting because now parents aren't oblivious to the fact that, hey, what's a small company? They're in fact encouraging their children who are in their 20s.
Do you think the COVID actually changed that?
For the digital ecosystem, COVID was really helpful.
The companies that are doing good in the West, people are trying to bring them in India.
Where will Indian innovation come from? Will it come from the larger companies or will it come from the smaller companies? The answer is
How do you find VCs?
10 years back, the VCs were so few, but now there are so many. If on the internet you don't find information about certain investors, for them, this is a lost opportunity.
Let's talk about the dark truths. Should founders go to VC capitalists?
The very clear answer is
Jivraj ji, बहुत 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 welcome on Miles to Million. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I'm very excited for the conversation.
Absolutely. I think after Modi became president, I think 2014, after that, the startup culture has grown so much. And I think India is the third largest ecosystem in startups, if I'm not wrong, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So do you think is that why we needed a show like Shark Tank in India?
Yeah, I think it was long time coming. I think the ecosystem in India for entrepreneurship is now 15 years in the making, perhaps. So Flipkart was started in 2008, which could possibly mark the mainstream success of startups. But it wasn't until like 2013, 2014, until it became evident that entrepreneurship can be something that could lead to success. And then until recently, I think COVID gave this a boost when everybody was at home, everybody was observing what others are doing. They observed what the startup culture was about, which further pushed the ecosystem. And then 2021 was the best year for Indian startups. There was a record amount of unicorns which were cultivated in that specific year. There were a record amount of VC funding that was coming in. But actually, the second fastest growing ecosystem, third in absolute number in terms of quantity, only behind, let's say, US, China there. So I think lots is happening. And I think Shark Tank is just the cherry on top because even after 21, 22, this was a very niche conversation. But now it's become a part of mainstream dinner table conversations where families are also talking about startups, entrepreneurship, brands, founding a company, starting a company. And I think that is very, very interesting because now parents aren't oblivious to the fact that, hey, what's a small company? What's a startup? Whether or not you can become a founder. They're in fact encouraging their children who are in their 20s, who are just graduating college, who are just thinking of, entering the workforce to actually take up something more risky, something more rewarding, something more value additive in nature. And I think Shark Tank has made it more mainstream, which means there will be more creators as opposed to job seekers. People will want to take that risk. Folks will understand that startups are about value creation, and you could generate asymmetrical returns as opposed to going to a mainstream general company, which is also great, by the way. But this is another option that you, if weren't aware before, you have now. I think Shark Tank has magnanimously changed the ecosystem. It's made stars out of founders, right? The founders who are on Shark Tank, who are sharks, they are now looked up to.
I think you've thrown a lot of nuggets here, and I'm just gonna take it one bit at a time.
Sure.
First thing that you said that after COVID, a lot of startups were happening. A lot of companies, a lot of people were thinking about creating their own startups. And the second thing that you said that parents are now open uh, for the children to explore the startup culture, the risk culture, I would say. Do you think the COVID actually changed that, or what was the thought behind parents that they were like, okay, we'll let our kids, figure out a startup culture, or is just that it's a buzzword these days?
I think COVID did play a role because I think initially, while of course the humanitarian impact of COVID was really unfortunate for the digital ecosystem, COVID was uh, really helpful, right? Because a lot of people came online. Folks who had never done a transaction before online were forced to now come online because that was the only viable means of communicating or getting a transaction done. So think e-commerce. E-commerce would have really boosted, which means on a consumer level, if you were going to a kirana store before, or if you're going to a retail shop before, for 3 months, your only options were going to an e-commerce website or going to like all of these grofers, Blinkit, these large scale aggregators of grocery shopping, which meant you started using these applications. You also started doing transactions online. So companies like Google Pay, Phone Pay, Paytm, all of them succeeded. So I think on a consumer level, everybody started to come online, which meant that entrepreneurs saw this as an opportunity and started building more companies. So a lot of companies spurred in that era. And when this happened, people were also online, which meant that talent was no bar. So let's say if I weren't in a Bangalore, Delhi, Bombay, Pune earlier, I would probably miss out on a good enough opportunity. But for that 1 year, when working remotely became largely acceptable, especially for smaller teams as well, it wouldn't matter if I came from, I don't know, randomly Gandhinagar, for instance, as well, right? Which is a small town in comparison to the metros in India. And you would still be able to work for a Bangalore based tech company because it didn't matter where you came from. What mattered is whether you would be able to add value. So I think that was the other thing that happened. So when consumers are all interacting with new age startups and people are working for new age startups, I think that anyway increases the penetration of the startup culture. And then there was, okay, Shark Tank making this a more dinner table conversation because largely beyond, again, the top 10, 15 cities in the country, a lot of parents will influence their children's decision of what to do further, right? And the aspiring job is a maybe a large company, an MNC, a consulting job, or the likes, right? But with this, having seen the culture, people have now become more accepting because they, okay, now use these products, they use these companies, they know about them, and they now seen validation that these companies are doing well, which means that, hey, if my son or daughter wants to actually work for some one of these companies, not even start, that's a great thing. And oh, if they want to also build something like this by themselves, that's also lovely. So I do think COVID did have a significant role to play there, and it transformed, like maybe speeded our culture in the startup space by a couple of years at the least, especially from the company's end and especially from the talent lens.
Do you also think the reason why the startup culture is also growing in India is the fact that a lot of people are seeing the gap what's in the economy of India? Because the way that I see is like I've seen like a lot of businesses that have grown in Western culture, let's say in US and Canada, right? The
Mhm.
companies that are doing good, the ideas that are doing good in the West, people are trying to bring them in India. I think that is also a great opportunity for Indian consumers to tap into that market.
I do think that's true. Largely, the macroeconomic argument is also to say that, hey, we all talk about, India being such a large country by size and by population, yet from an economical lens, we're not where we should be, right? You could make the argument that China was in a similar circumstance, but it took them 30, 40 years to become a global superpower. So where will Indian innovation come from? Will it come from the larger companies or will it come from the smaller companies? The answer is it will come from these smaller disruptive companies led by these individuals who are hustling and targeting challenging problems and solving them by themselves, right? Because if grassroots innovation does not happen from these larger companies are built for process systems, they will run very well, they will drive the economy on a larger basis. But the innovation, the disruption, the newer trends will be captured by these smaller companies. If you look at the US itself, right, the top 5 companies in the US were at some point new age companies, right? If you look at an Amazon 97, Apple, which is like around 1970, 80, Microsoft, similarly, that time, whatnot, right? Facebook, all of these companies were at some point, smaller startups which were venture backed. So I think India is also moving in that direction. In India, we have an example in Zomato now. Zomato is valued at $20 billion. They're significantly large. They're doing incredibly well. It's taken them 15 years, but they're now in a lot of spectrums. In fact, this week there was chatter of them going into another different. So they're primarily, for context, they're a food delivery business, but they also have a grocery application in the form of Blinkit, which means they have commerce from a food lens and a grocery lens, and they're now going into events and ticketing as well,
Oh,
and they can do a lot more. And they're also stakeholders in a company called Shiprocket, which does logistics. So that's an ecosystem in itself, right? So we'll see a lot more companies like that. Flipkart is a good example. Flipkart does so much in India beyond e-commerce, similarly like what Amazon does in the US, right? We're having a lot of these companies come up, and I do think a lot of these trends. I think US gives us the way because they've been ahead from a consumer lens, from a company lens, from an economical lens, which means there are patterns which are set, which will be replicated. But you'd be surprised by the number of very interesting India first problems that are being tackled in the country as well, because you can only replicate solutions till a point, and more than that, you can replicate more consumer trends that, okay, people will be healthy at some point, people will spend on discretionary items at some point, right? So you can build solutions for that, but there are a lot of Indian first solutions as well. So I think, in conclusion, a lot of this innovation will come from startups, and that is where I personally am very bullish on the ecosystem. The next 10 years will perhaps define India's sort of, economy trajectory for the next 50. And it's a privilege to be in the Indian startup tech ecosystem right now, because you get to see it live, as opposed to, missing the bus and seeing that, okay, all of the action was happening earlier, right? So I think that way it's very, very interesting.
and I heard I was having one conversation with my brother, and he was saying that the best time to invest is in Indian startups
Absolutely.
because in like next 10, 20 years it's gonna be growing so much. It's gonna be a boom in Indian economy. So I'm looking forward to that. Comes back to your story.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Not giving away way too much, but you at one time also wanted to start a startup.
This was actually about 4 years back, and that's how I actually stumbled upon most of what I do today, by the way. So I'm glad I gave it an attempt to start a company. But this was right when I was graduating college. This was in the COVID year as well. So I too was, seeing a lot of startups around me, and I was like, hey, let's maybe give this a shot. Now, if I wouldn't now, I don't know when I would. I had a placement from campus, which was in a trading job, and I said no to that, and instead went ahead and tried to build a website that would connect people from a mentorship lens on demand for study abroad and job preparation as a use case. A very simple example is that, hey, if you were trying to, apply to Harvard University, you would ideally want to talk to an alum from Harvard, as opposed to talking to an admissions counselor or a career counselor who has never been to Harvard itself, right? Or if you were applying to a job at McKinsey and you had your interview in a week, I would much rather talk to somebody who's at McKinsey right now. And I would love to have a website for it, because it felt strange that I could go to an application and book food like Zomato. I could go to an application and, book travel like Uber. Yet, if I really wanted to talk to somebody for a very defining decision in my career, I wouldn't be able to, because the ways to do it would be, I would LinkedIn them, I would email them, I would ask a friend, but these are not assured ways. So in my head, that problem seemed viable, and there are a couple of companies that actually solve for it now. There's a company in the US called Intro, which solves for expert-led advice. There's a couple of companies otherwise also doing good work in this space.
When I was in my college days, We came up with an app. Well, the school itself came up with the app, or I think they partnered with some app that allowed college students to connect
Mhm.
with the network of people who are working in certain companies, and then you want to apply in those companies, and then you will get one-on-one mentorship with people who are
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
who are working at that company. So I went through one-on-one mentorship with one of the people who was working at IBM, and it gives you a lot of good experience that, okay, this is what you're expected as college hire to work, and then how the work environment's gonna be like. It's a really great idea. It's a really great idea.
No, I really thought so as well. I think the difficulty in that, and it was a learning experience. I was a bit at the time. I don't think I was accustomed to building a tech company. I come from a business background. I studied finance and accounting back in college. So I didn't know how to exactly build a tech company. And I was very new to business as well. So I think I made a lot of rookie mistakes. But in hindsight, all in good time. I was very young. I was early in my journey. I was 21. And thankfully, all of those mistakes led me to do what I now do, because I started a podcast, because I didn't have an ecosystem or a network or a support system around me at the time, because I didn't know many founders. So when I could not make my startup work, I was found almost without like a almost helpless without a support system. And I realized, hey, there should be a space where I can learn about how to build a company. And that's when I stumbled upon a bunch of these US podcasts that talk about startups, that talk about entrepreneurship, that give you real tangible insights on how to build a company. But hey, I was like, I don't know if these are applicable in India. I don't know how to understand them and localize them. Context was missing. So I was like, hey, can somebody really point me to an Indian podcast that talks about how Flipkart was built, how Ola was built, how Zomato was built? These are all very, very large unicorns in India. And I realized that, hey, nobody was doing so. And even if people were, I felt that these conversations were mostly information. So I think in my head, knowledge is two-way. One is information, and then is insights. I wanted to be a part of the insights layer, and I wanted to really go deep, which is when I started the podcast. So trying to build a company and failing at it led me to starting a podcast to solve my problems. And yeah, here we are today.
How would you explain a difference between angel investor versus VC to a person who hasn't known about these topics, who don't even know about these terms? How would you explain that?
Sure, let me give this a stab. Firstly, investing in startups is giving capital to a company and giving in instead of equity in return, which means a share of future profit. So I will give you a certain amount of money that you will utilize today and in the future, and if that becomes successful, I will own a chunk of your business. So that's the fundamental aspect of investing. Now, an angel investor invests individual money. So it could be the likes of you and me, it could be the likes of high net worth individuals, folks who have generated a certain amount of their wealth and want to invest in startups. And it is purely them investing in startups. It could be out of passion, it could be for financial return, it could be to give back, it could be a founder who's made a lot of wealth and wants to just mentor other founders. It could be any of those reasons. But a venture capitalist or a venture capital fund will be more institutional in nature, simply meaning their primary objective will always be return on capital, because they're not investing their own capital. They are taking capital from a set of limited partners. These are larger institutions. Think banks, sometimes governments, sometimes endowment funds. These funds will all give a professional manager money, which manages a VC fund, and that VC fund will then invest in multiple startups, hoping to make a net return and giving back that money at the appreciation to their limited partners. So a objective differs, right? An angel investor could be investing for multiple reasons beyond return on capital. However, for a VC fund, that is the primary objective. Then the nature of capital in a VC fund is borrowed. Borrowed may not be the right word. Let's say it's more responsible. There's a fiduciary responsibility towards that capital. Here, as an angel investor, your capital is proprietary. It is yours. It is up to your discretion the way you want to utilize it. So that's the other distinction. And then style of investing as well. Considering that the odds, like you're not consequentially investing because quantums will be different. An angel investor, since they're investing in their individual capacity, will probably be investing astronomically lower amounts, right? Like there will be at least a good 50 to 100x difference, right? If an angel investor is putting in maybe 100K a year in a company, 100K in a year in startups, a VC fund perhaps is putting in at least 10 million and more in startups. So the quantum will differ, which means also style of investing will differ, because here you'll probably segregate this $100,000 into, let's say, 5K per company. So that's 20 companies. That's 5K per company, which may not be consequential. A VC fund, however, cares about ownership. Without getting too technical, the idea is that if you know that this angel investor is investing individual money, which is proprietary and has multiple different objectives beyond return on capital, that's one. And the VC fund has the contra opposite objectives.
So, in simple terms, an angel investor is someone who is passionate about your idea and wants to invest in your idea. And then in turn, they'll get ROI, like some percentage of the ROI, right?
Yes.
As opposed to VC, it's an institution that invests in your startup, and in return, they're getting the stakeholder of the company,
Yes.
or
Yes.
the shareholder of the company.
They are the shareholders of the company. They invest capital in return for certain shares of the company.
How do you find VCs? Let's say, given a scenario, having I have an idea, and I think idea के बेस पे तो वो आपको इन्वेस्ट नहीं करने वाले. You have to provide MVP, like minimum viable product. You have to provide कि आपके पास इतने customers हैं, like this is the amount of revenue you're generating, and then you go out and then find VCs. So how is the process?
From the founder lens, I think what you need to show is preparation on the fact that you can build a large company. Now, if you only have an idea, it does not mean a VC will not invest, but does that show enough preparation on your end, enough in- initiative on your end? Maybe not. But if you've taken a step towards your idea in the form of a MVP, you validated your idea with customers, you made some progress, I think that shows more and gives me a proof point as an investor to further be interested in the conversation. So, ideally, as a founder, you should think about what you want to build, really test it out. Testing it out may mean by building a product, may also mean by doing rigorous market research from a secondary lens, by talking to, from a primary lens, by talking to a lot of customers, right? Like whatever problem statement you're trying to tackle, let's say you're trying to build a AI chatbot for lawyers, right? You may not have built that chatbot yet. However, if you can talk to 100 lawyers, understand their pain point from a deeper lens. Let's say you yourself are a lawyer as well, right? You will have much more to show for than somebody who is just saying, "Hey, I want to build an AI chatbot for lawyers." So I think the idea is to provide more proof points from insights, from your conversations with others, from your research, from your approach to how you will build a company, and that will convince an investor, because an investor is trying to understand, hey, are you the best person to build the kind of company that you're talking about? So an investor is taking primarily, without complicating it a lot, a twofold investment. One is on the person and the team. And the second is on the market itself, right? So if you're building a very niche solution, let's say within lawyers only for paralegals, versus you're building for lawyers as a whole and paralegals, this will of course be larger because of just the kind of customers you can serve, right? So a venture investor will actually prefer companies with larger market sizes fundamentally.
They see your vision, like what's your like 5, 10, 20, 30 year vision.
Exactly. How deeply do you understand the pain point? How large can you make this company? How ambitious are you? Are there proof points from the past that prove you're ambitious? Can you face adversity? Because building a startup is a very difficult journey. If you become successful, it will take a reasonably long amount of time, which means all of these softer aspects become a very, very crucial part of what you want to do. And then critical thinking to saying that, okay, have you thought through what your execution will look like? Have you executed in the past? Can you work with a lot of ownership? Because initially, like all of the large companies that we look at right now are large once they are successful, but let's say the 4, 5, 7 years it takes for people to recognize that, okay, this is heading somewhere, it's going to be very lonely. You have to execute yourself, and you have to be the one ensuring that things are on track. So can you do all of that, right? Are you more accustomed in your past experiences to not take initiative and have a team to you, or have you hustled in the past? Have you ensured that, okay, you can build things from scratch? So I think all of these questions are what a VC is trying to constantly answer in all of their interactions with their founder. And then you go ahead and decide that, okay, this is a good space and these are the best founders to build a company in this space. Let's go ahead and do this investment. That's usually the nature of investment in the early stages because there's not much to prove. So if you're a founder with an idea, I recommend just drill down further as to, hey, what makes your idea very compelling? The insights, the vision for it, the mode of execution. Then test it out. This should not be theoretical in nature.
You should not be dating anyone. You
Yes.
should not be in a relationship.
Yeah. And I mean, just like ensure that you're all in. That's the thing that's connected, because I think this is just such a tough journey. That's what I've heard constantly from founders in my network, and they all keep iterating that if you're starting a company because it's glamorous, that's the last reason to start a company.
Mm.
You should start one because you are in it for the long run. You recognize the problem statement and feel passionately about it. And if you do it for those reasons, I think there'll be higher odds of success.
I think you've doing podcasts for 4 years now,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you've gained a lot of knowledge, right? Do you think at some point you will start a company?
Absolutely. I think my pursuit is always. I think, especially after doing the podcast, by the way, since on a every episode level I talk to a founder, that energy is just contagious. It's going to be tough. It's going to be challenging, but you want to take up that journey for sure. In a small way, I do think I'm living some amount of it with the podcast, trying to invest, building something out of it. But I do think there is a one founder journey in me, in my life, and I am waiting for that right time. Thankfully, the experiences I've had in the last 3, 4 years have given me enough conviction to say that, hey, when I stumble upon the right thing, I will not be afraid to take that leap of faith. So it's a matter of accumulating experiences and ensuring that I continue doing my best work in what I am doing. And when the time is right, I do think I will build a company, and that's a personal milestone for me as well, to at least give it an attempt. All my wisdom from the podcast tells me that, I mean, most regrets in life are not things that we didn't do, but things we didn't try. This is a borrowed line. I was hearing a podcast yesterday itself, and it was there by Adam Grant, who's this very famous professor and organizational psychologist, and he put it really well. So I think, yeah, trying, I will definitely give it an attempt in the future for sure.
I think one of the best things I've come across so far is seeing a VC capitalist, right? Seeing an angel investor sitting right in front of me. Because I feel like they're very secret person, like they're just there to invest in your companies, but no one has actually come out and made a content about it, right? Especially in India, I think, right? I think you are the one person that is coming out and building a
Mhm.
content about VC capitalists, because we've never seen the other side of the story, right?
Yeah.
We've known a little bit about how founders go through, how is their journey, but we haven't learned about a VC capitalist. We haven't come across the idea of what they go through.
No, that's correct. I think the venture capital industry is actually very opaque. Like people haven't known much about it until very recently, and that too mostly in the US. I think people in India are starting to recognize that hey, this is something that people appreciate. So as I think it's a matter of time as well now. So think about it this way: we are now 15 years, 20 years old as an ecosystem in startups. The founders of today are more mature. 10 years back, the VCs were so few that even if you weren't there in the public, you weren't talking much about what you do, you would still be the people that founders talk to, right? Because there were just like 10 people, right? Like 10 institutions you would talk to all as a founder. But now there are so many. We're in a world of like, there must be 250, 300 VC funds in the country at the least, which means a founder has so many options. So let's say you start up, you come back and you're like, I want to build a company in India. You wouldn't know where to go to, so you would start with the internet. And if on the internet you don't find information about certain investors, you'll probably not approach them, which means for them this is a lost opportunity, because if they can't talk to you, they can definitely not invest in your company. So I think people are becoming more aware about this, and there are some funds in India actually doing good work in the last 2 3 years to actually put out a lot of content. Some peers around me also that I'm really inspired by their work. They're trying to do good stuff. So Matrix Partners in India, which is also a US fund, they're doing really good content in India. There's a fund called Axel, which is also in the US. They were first investors in Facebook. So that's one of their biggest hits. They in India are doing some really good content, and bunch of people. But I don't. I think there's a difference in doing content for the sake of it versus for genuinely adding value. And I think
Hmm.
we're coming to the latter now. I think initially it started off as, hey, everybody else is doing it, so we might want to put ourselves out there a bit as well. I don't think that compounds. I think a large part of what I also got right, and I don't think I planned it, but I just told myself, hey, let's do this for a year. I'll put an episode every week and let's see where it goes, without any expectation. And I think that just compounded, which means discipline, consistency compounds. However, as a VC fund, things are very abrupt. This is not what you do for a living. This is not what derive. This is not what gives you joy, or perhaps this is not very natural to your work, right? Which means that you will not do it consistently. You will be more abrupt about it, and that will then become a bottleneck because it won't show you results. And then if you're very ROI minded about a podcast or a blog or a report, I don't think you do it enough. So I think now people are trying to internalize that, hey, no, I already do. As a VC fund, you do such great research work. That's your job, primarily, right? You have such great insights. We just have to put it out there. We have to make all of these things accessible to as many founders. And if we as an ecosystem do that, knowledge will not be a bar for any founder who wants to start. I think that's my personal mission, and everybody reckons with it. But I think VC funds are coming around, and I think a lot of founders are now able to search for good content. We're still a long way to go. I think the US ecosystem, in comparison, you will have a lot of vertical content for things like just fundraising, for just sales, for just product, for just marketing. We're not there yet. We're still very, in fact, I'm privy of this as well. My podcast is also mostly general on founders and on venture capital investors, right? However, I do also want to get to a point where, let's say, I'm sure in 5 years in India, you'll have a podcast specifically for marketing, specifically for VCs, specifically for angel investors. And that will come up soon as well, because I think the founder of today is very smart, and they are looking for these options. And people will just figure it out that we should, raise our hand and build it out.
Now that you've said that, like, we're at stage that in next 5 to 10 years, India will see a lot of podcasts around marketing and around like VCs, around angel investors. How do you think branding plays a role in that? How a VC capitalist or angel investors create their branding so that it's also easy for founders to find them, and also it's like, like equal relationship between them.
So, foundationally, the important principle to understand is that, hey, if there's a good founder out there, capital will chase that founder, because there will be three, four funds which will recognize that, hey, this is a great founder and we want to invest in them, which means it will become the founder's choice to actually take capital from one out of the four funds, hypothetically, right? Which means this founder will now go to an investor that he or she respects, really wants to take capital from, and admires. Now, this respect and admiration needs to come across via social media, and thus creating content in some shape or form only benefits you. And it does not have to come at the cost of additional time, effort. Like sometimes when we think of building a brand or thinking of creating content, right, we think of it as to the extreme, right? Which is like, hey, I want to get like millions of followers, or hey, I don't want to do it at all. But I do think there's a very viable in between, which is to say that, hey, whatever I already do, let me put out for very little effort. And if that compounds, if there are serious folks who read it, I think I will anyway grow some amount of following. I think that's also been a very crucial learning. And if VCs do this well, then the founders of tomorrow will, in the next 5 years, let's say there's a very good founder today in college, they're 20 years old. By the time they're 25, they would, read all your content, because that will be so value additive for them. And the next day, when they start to build a company 5 years later, they will be like, hey, I really admire this person for putting out their thoughts. Can I go and take capital from them? It builds really strong trust, it builds a strong brand, and it makes your capital desirable, so that founders come to you, approach you. So I think this is going to be a very natural step. A lot of folks have started to realize it. I do think we're yet to see a lot of mainstream successes from it. We have a couple founders who've done this well. There's a great podcast called The Barber Shop with Shantanu Deshpande. He's the founder of a company, and he has some really great conversations with founders. There's also another founder called Mukesh Bansal. He started one unicorn in India called Cult, which is a premier aggregator of gyms in the country. And he's also built Mintra, which is the fashion e-commerce marketplace acquired by Flipkart. And he also has a very thriving podcast now. So I think podcasts are now becoming, in a very strong way, mainstream. We also have the example of Nikhil Kamath. He's a billionaire from India. He's built the company Zerodha. And he's having some incredible conversations on his podcast. So I think folks are recognizing the power of social media. And I know on a day-to-day basis, across weeks in the last 3 4 years, I've had so many conversations with venture investors from funds talking about, hey, we want to do this, we want to do a podcast, we want to figure something out, can we, like, understand what you do? And that's been so nice to see, because I've actually seen that transition, like at a point where I could question the number of podcasts that were there talking about entrepreneurship in India, to now there being enough, if not plenty, and there will also be more. And I'm hoping that there will be more. So I think it's pretty good. And we could, I mean, if let's say you want to understand more about India as an ecosystem, right, I would question the number of options you would have to understand about India. I would also question, let's say, is there a podcast that bridges the India US gap? So I mean, there are so many, like, if we have to question where are these options, then we will have answers in a couple of years if we don't have immediately.
Let's talk about the dark truths. Should founders go to VC capitalists? Should founders build their companies the traditional way? Should they bootstrap their company, or they go out? invest in VC capitalists.
That's a very very strong debate. I think the very clear answer is knowing if you need the capital, and if you're building a venture capital returner. I'll tell you what that means. So, some companies require investment from the outside because they need growth capital. They need large amounts of capital that help them get to a point after which they start becoming profitable. These are usually product companies or disruptive ideas, which are like, a let's say, a hardware idea. SpaceX is a good example, right? So SpaceX wouldn't have been able to build an immediate rocket, which means they wouldn't have revenue until they build a rocket, which means it needs risk capital, right? And if that rocket would have been built, then it would have been a large return for everyone around. They got the NASA contract, etc. But they had to be venture backed because it was a reasonably risky thing to do, and it would not generate returns at the start. In comparison, let's take a service company, which is a lifestyle business, right? Let's say I am doing marketing solutions for a lot of brands. So you give me money, I will arrange vendors, I will do my creative work, I will have a margin, and I will get revenue from day zero. Do I need external capital for this? No, because my offering is sorted, my need gap is sorted, my revenue is sorted, right? What will I do with the capital? So you could argue that service companies may not need capital because you're making revenue, you have profitability, you can take the profitable parts and actually reinvest in the business. So why would you want to go to an external investor and
Mhm.
dilute your profits, right? Why would you want to give your a piece of your company to an external investor? However, product companies like an Airbnb, for 10 years raised capital, right? And they've been one of the largest successes in the last 15-20 years. They were started in 2008, they went public 2022. And that kind of a business requires capital, because you couldn't have taken like five properties and been like, we will continue growing only these five properties and we'll be profitable. Because the meat of that business is, can we go, capture the entirety of United States in terms of supply of Airbnbs? Can we expand beyond the US? Can we go to other countries? All of that requires growth capital, which means your business has to be venture funded, right? Which means there's an advantage to getting a venture investor, which will give you large amounts of capital. You will utilize it for the growth, and in return, they will get a share of future profits. It'll help you build a company for the long term, very large, scalable. So the question to answer is, are you building a VC backable company or are you building a lifestyle business? If you're building a
Mhm.
lifestyle services business, highly profitable, then you should bootstrap. I don't think you should then get attracted to VC capital. Valuations sometimes attract people. These headlines cover only VC backed businesses. So sometimes it can become attractive as a founder, but I think you should know what kind of business you're trying to build. And then also, when you when you go to a VC, you're setting up a very high expectation, by the way, because if you unless you build a very very large company, nobody wins. Because that's the game of the venture capital business, right? You have to build large companies. However, some people don't want that. Some people want every year to see profits. They want to take back good capital back for themselves as a founder. They want to, not grow at astronomical paces. They want some amounts of, let's say, more balance in their lives, which is absolutely okay. So there will be a combination of both types of businesses which will exist. As a founder, you should just be very rational in saying, do I need this? Because see, when you go to an investor, you're also parting away with the most for expensive thing that you can give to somebody, a piece of your company, right? So it does
Yeah.
not come very easy. It's not
Yeah.
coming at no cost. You have to be very cautious in saying, do I really want to give somebody else a piece of my company? And what cost does it mean, right? So yeah, I think you should make that call very very carefully.
Yeah. I think when you're blowing up like million-dollar planes like in one day, one test, you do need a VC capitalist. You do need funding from other people.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it all depends on like what kind of like revenue you also are kind of getting. Like what are the sources of revenue you're getting from?
Yeah. India's technically always been a very bootstrapped, services driven economy, which is absolutely great, right? Like 50 years back, if you had to make money, you would take some capital of yourself, you would put it in a factory, that factory would then start making revenue, and it would be very highly profitable, and it would be revenue generating, and that's absolutely great. A lot of people still continue doing that, and a lot of great companies exist. So this is not to say that venture capital businesses are better or they can be larger. It's just a different type of capital. It requires more risk, etc. So I think there's no good or bad. It's just what are you trying to achieve from the company that you're trying to build. If that has a clear answer, you will eventually be able to say that, okay, this is the pathway I should undertake.
Perfect. Well, Jivraj, it was pleasure talking to you. Before we part ways, is there anything else you would like to tell our audience?
No, I think this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. One thing that I communicate is my favorite quote, which is borrowed, but it says, fail to never fail to try to fail, but never fail to try. I think that's a motto I try to live by. But thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. Same here.